Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Path to DevOps series. Today we're turning the page and continuing with our list of milestones that we have to achieve in order to improve the current setup that we have. And the first one on our list, as the title says, is coupling together the build and the deployment pipeline. So if this sounds fun, let's get straight to it. First, let's talk strategy, because we can't make changes before getting a plan put together. The first strategy that we could employ is linking the existing build and deployment pipelines. And we could do that through an artifact. Basically, this artifact would be something that the build pipeline outputs and that the deployment pipeline consumes as input. Obviously, we already create the Docker image as an artifact, but this is not sufficient for the deployment pipeline to be able to consume the build pipeline. We also need some sort of metadata to be passed on from the build pipeline to the deployment one in order for the deployment to know what version of the application or what Docker image should it deploy. The second possible strategy that we could employ is to put everything together in one big pipeline, which also builds the Docker image and then deploys it to Kubernetes. This would be an interesting one, but I'm saving it for much later when we will have multiple environments. Spoilers, I know. But right now we're going to implement the first possible strategy, which is creating this artifact which connects the existing build and deploy pipelines. That being said, before moving forward and showing you the cool changes that we can do in order to link the build and the deploy pipeline, I want to point out the fact that if you want to follow along, you can find the code on my GitHub account, which will be linked down in the description below. And also that the changes are no longer on the main branch. The main branch is for people who are getting started with the path to DevOps and they need the original build and deploy pipeline manifests. Instead, we now have a new branch called feature link build to deploy. And this is basically where I've added the changes to the build and the deployment manifests. And we'll go through these changes in just a few seconds. Before starting to explain the changes in the code, I want to explain the mechanism behind the solution I've chosen. As you know, if you followed along until now, the deployment pipeline relies on a variable called image_tag in order to know what version of the Docker image or what tag of the Docker image it should deploy to Kubernetes. And this applies to all three deployment pipelines. Now, what I want to implement is a way for the build pipeline to pass along this image tag variable to the deployment pipeline. And I've implemented just this. I'll show you how in just a moment. Let's choose card API, for example, and I'll just edit the YAML manifest so you can see it as well. And let me show you the changes. Yeah, if we scroll down to the building an image PowerShell step, you'll notice that I added one or two lines here. Actually, it's a comment for me to know what I'm doing, obviously, and I recommend you add comments to your code so that when you check it later in time, you know what you've done here. And then I've actually created a key called image_tag, all in capital letters, and then I added an equal sign, and I'm also adding the variable of the build number, because if you remember correctly, the build number is our tag. Yeah, so this is how our Docker image gets tagged. So basically I'm creating this string right here, and then I'm writing this string into the build artifact staging directory, which is a variable provided by Azure DevOps. And inside of this directory, I'm putting everything in a file called pipeline.env. So at the end of this command, I will have a file called pipeline.env, which contains this information. Okay? And then moving down, I will also take the whole build artifact staging directory and I will publish it as an artifact on the build pipeline. And let me show you. If we go back to pipelines and I go to card API and I choose the latest run from some time ago, you will see that I have one published artifact in here. And if I click on it, it will download the pipeline.env. Yeah, this is basically how it looks like. Yeah, I have image tag and then the number. This works fantastically because I'm not sending secret information from the build pipeline to the deploy pipeline, because as you've seen here, everything is in plain text. I don't mind sending a Docker image tag over to the deploy pipeline. That's totally fine. I don't care if someone knows about it, okay? Which is why I'm implementing this solution right here. Now onto our deploy pipeline to see what's changed there. I will choose the cart API deploy one. And already, as you can see here, I've done some tests, so it was automatically triggered. Yeah, I'll show you how in just 1 second. If we hit edit, you will notice here in resources that aside from repositories, I now have pipelines. So I'm teaching the deploy pipeline that it needs to take into account a different resource, which is basically the build pipeline. And as you can see here, I've put in the name of the pipeline. This is what the source key is all about. And here the pipeline key is actually a text identifier that you will use throughout the pipeline if you need it. But this is basically the name of the pipeline that you're depending on, okay? And then triggered true means that regardless of the branch the build pipeline is built from, I want this deployment pipeline to trigger afterwards, okay? So now that this is all said and done, let's look at the code changes down below. So the first one is actually downloading the artifact from the build pipeline. And as you can see here, you need to put in some information, the project ID and the pipeline ID. This is the ID of the build pipeline. And I'll show you how to take this one. So if you go to pipelines and you select your cart API, you will notice in the URL up top, right here, yeah, you have the definition ID equals 19. In my case, that's the pipeline, yeah, pipeline 19. And also you have the project ID. Now the project ID is a little bit trickier to find, but I'll show you how to do that from the web interface as well. You open a new tab here, you go to your Azure DevOps organization, and onto your projects page, you hit F12 to open the developer console, yeah, and you will want to inspect the element, yeah, so you hit this here. And if we look at the path to DevOps one, there we go, yeah, if we select the box for path to DevOps, it will bring you to the class which contains the name of your project and then the ID, yeah, you have it here. Okay, so all you need to do is go to developer tools, inspect the element, and you'll be able to find your project ID, which I have also added here in the deployment pipeline. Yeah, it's necessary information. So basically, once we've configured this, the deployment pipeline will be able to download that pipeline.env file. And then I've written a small PowerShell script to ingest all of the variables from that file. Yeah, basically we're taking each line, we're separating by equal, and then whatever is before the equal is the key of the variable, and whatever is after is the value. And then we use command from Azure pipelines to expose everything as environment variables. Having explained the logic, I still need to underline the fact that you need to do this for all 6 pipelines, 3 build and 3 deploy. Yeah, so you make all of the changes in all of them, and eventually you will reach the state I am at right now, where the build pipelines are connected to their respective deployment pipelines. And you also need to make sure you have removed the variable on the deploy pipeline, because you no longer need it. You will have it passed on by the build pipeline. Okay, so you can remove it from here, hit the trash button, and it will be deleted, and then save. Now, I've talked a lot about how it should be implemented and how we've implemented it. Let's see everything in action. And I'm going to go to pipelines, and I'll show you the terminal so that you know I'm not lying. Let's check our AKS cluster. kubectl get pods namespace shiki, and there we go. We have no resources found. Now I'm going to trigger the cart API. I'm going to trigger the product API. And last but not least, I'm going to trigger the front end A few moments later. Okay, this took quite some time because I'm running on the one free agent and there were 6 jobs which needed to complete in succession. But as you can see, all 6 pipelines have successfully completed, and you can notice that the 3 build ones were manually triggered by me, but the 3 deploy counterparts were automatically triggered. Yeah, just as I said. And if we open the terminal one more time and we look at the pods, there they are, 6 successful, healthy running pods. And let's look at the services as well. You can see the front-end service has an external IP address, which I will copy and I will paste into the browser. And lo and behold, here we have our application stack. And if I click the Buy Now button, you can see the functionality is here. It took a few seconds, but it's here, okay? So we've successfully deployed our application one more time into the cluster by linking the build and deploy pipelines together. So now, whenever you trigger the build pipeline, which you can do automatically from a commit, when you push something to Git, you can have an automatic build, and then there will be an automatic deploy to follow that, okay? So thanks a lot for your time for today. This is it with this part of the milestone. We'll continue next time with the next item on our list. And thank you very much for watching so far. If you follow along on this journey and you haven't, I would appreciate if you subscribe now and maybe hit the like button below. And thank you for sticking along. Once again, have a great day. Cheers.